Hi, and welcome to the Silvercrest podcast. My name is Bernard Paternina. I'm a portfolio manager here at Silvercrest, and I'm joined by Alex Waldorf, partner and senior analyst for our value equity team. How are you, Alex?
I'm doing great, Bernard. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have this conversation with you. You and I have been going back and forth for years now on this subject, and you wrote a fascinating article, and I'm excited to hear a little bit more, kind of talk about it a little bit more and flesh it out.
Great. You know, it's a topic that I have a deep interest in, you know, because of some of my background in energy, and I think what I tried to flesh out a little bit in the writing was this idea that Bitcoin and energy have always sort of been in the same sentence, only to the extent of how much energy does.
It's always
Bitcoin
been
network.
negative, right?
It has. Well, it's understandable in a way, because we're sort of taught that energy is this precious resource, and you know, we don't maybe want to be using it in certain ways if some people believe that to not be the highest and best use.
Right.
But it turns out that energy systems are very complex, and it's not just about the amount of energy that something uses, but in this case, there are more important questions, frankly. Number one, what kind of energy is being used by, in this case, the Bitcoin mining network? Number two, when or at what times is that energy being consumed? And then finally, number three, what are the second order effects or externalities into that energy system that is brought by the introduction of Bitcoin mining as a load? And I think when you examine the issue through that lens, you come to a lot of interesting and counterintuitive realities, and that was very, very sort of fertile ground, I think, for exploration.
I thought it was fascinating, your comments on the fact that the Bitcoin mining, the different aspects of Bitcoin mining could be useful to stabilize a grid. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit more about the grid, demand and supply of energy, and how Bitcoin mining could possibly stabilize the grid?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and complex topic. And when you talk about grids, there's not just one grid design, of course. There's a whole host of different types of electricity grids in different countries, serving different types of load. And by load, I mean just a consumer of electricity.
Sure.
And I thought that it was particularly useful to zoom in on Texas as an example, because they have a little bit of everything, and they have sort of their own self-contained grid called ERCOT. And I think the most important thing to remember about a grid is that at any given time, that grid has to be maintained in balance between the supply of electricity being injected into the system and the usage of that electricity being pulled out for all of the consumer and industrial use cases that we know of. And I think it was Sean Connell at Lancium who referred to this as the heartbeat of the grid. I like that analogy. In the US, it's 60 hertz, so that's the frequency of our grid. In Europe, it's 50. But the point is that system has to be kept in balance within a reasonably narrow tolerance, or else you have system failures and the power goes out, right? Brownouts, blackouts. The high degree of reliability that we're used to as developed world consumers of electricity is entirely dependent on the ability to dynamically balance the supply and demand into and out of this system.
One interesting comment, and this is a bit of an aside, but you mentioned that the efficiency of the grid, I found it quite shockingly low. Mm-hmm. Only in terms of like the amount of energy that is actually put to use was like something close to 60%. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, so there's really two steps to think about when we talk about power, right? First, I think it's important to state that the first step in this process is taking a primary energy input, whether it's coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, whatever your primary energy input is, and converting that into electric energy or electricity, as we call it, right? Then the second step is the use of that electricity. So when you talk about some of the conversion factors, taking primary electricity and even just getting it into the form of electric energy, you lose a lot of potential energy in that process. But then you have further potential energy loss either in transmission or, frankly, if you expend the resources in dollars or in carbon to generate electricity, but then that electricity is not used, it's simply dissipated as heat, so
Right.
that the energy just sort of changes form. And so the thing to remember, I think, about this delicate balance is that even at the best and highest level of engineering, we are always going to have some waste in the system. And I think that is a backdrop with which to begin to understand how Bitcoin mining fits in. Because a grid really has to be engineered to peak demand, not average demand.
Right.
If we engineered the grid to average demand, the lights wouldn't turn on half the time. And that obviously
It could cause a problem or two.
could cause a problem or two.
Right.
And so when you think about what goes in on the supply side and what comes out on the demand side, it used to be a lot easier, right? Let's go back 20 years, kind of before the build out in renewables. You had coal plants, you had natural gas plants, you had nuclear plants. These sources of energy have relatively stable and high capacity factors. By capacity factor, what I mean, let's take a nuclear plant, for example, which might have a capacity factor of 90%.
What does capacity factor mean?
So what it means is that if it's let's say a 1 gigawatt nameplate capacity nuclear plant, that's its stated highest potential capacity.
Okay.
Let's say on average over a year, how much are you going to get out of it? So if you're getting 900 megawatts
So it's output, essentially.
Yeah, it's
Gotcha.
your realized output relative to kind of the highest potential output that you could get under perfect circumstances.
And those call them classical forms of sources of energy, the output is fairly stable. Is that correct?
That's right. It's much more stable in comparison to renewables, and I
Right.
think that's the key point. So pre-renewables, when the grid on the electricity generation side, the supply side, was more these more traditional sources, planning for grid stability was a bit easier because you could over-engineer, the electricity generation, and that essentially would compensate for the naturally variable demand on the other side, whether it's 7 o'clock and everyone's home, cooking their dinner, or it's 4 a.m. in the morning and nobody's lights are on and no one's using as much electricity, right?
Right.
And then the missing piece was that there could be pieces of electricity demand, usually high energy or energy intensive industrial processes that could come in and soak up that excess electricity, but not very well.
It's
frankly.
use it or lose it, right?
That's right. I mean, that's really the other critical part to understand. And the way I'll say it is that electricity is not fungible across time and space. So when we think about resources, think about oil or copper or water, these very important things, to our lives, we can actually stop and conserve that thing physically very often and use it, maybe in the future when we're in a time of need. We can't really do that with electricity. Yes, there are batteries and there are grid scale batteries, but currently grid scale battery technology can only kind of keep a large enough grid relevant charge for maybe 2 to 4 hours.
I get the sense that storage on that sort of industrial capacity isn't really ready for prime time.
That's right. I mean, there are new technologies. There's a lot of money and smart engineering talent being poured into battery technology, and no doubt there'll be breakthroughs. But as we stand today, there isn't the ability to just load up every grid with an overabundance of batteries, because one, current battery technologies have a hard time keeping enough charge for long enough at a high enough scale to be relevant to a grid as a source to be pulled from. And our current technologies also require us to essentially, dig out of the earth a potentially impracticably large amount of battery grade metals, which is another challenge as well, which isn't very ESG friendly if you want to tie it back to where those primary materials are coming from.
So we have supply of energy. We have that fluctuates, especially with renewable energy. Mm-hmm. We have demand of energy, which appears to fluctuate on a minute-by-minute basis as well. So there are several seasonality effects on a daily basis, but also throughout the year. I assume you have a very good chart, a very interesting chart, where you have fluctuations of energy usage throughout the day and also throughout the months of the year, which I thought was very interesting. So you've got these sort of two dynamics, supply and demand, in the energy space. Where does Bitcoin fit into all this?
So it's really the central question here, and I think the way that I would state it is going back to the essential responsibility of a grid operator, right? Is to keep that balance.
Okay.
And what we've done by introducing more renewables into our grids, let's again take Texas as an example. On average, approximately 30% of ERCOT electricity is renewable. That's data that's a year old or so. But on any day, it could be 10, it could be 70, right? That 30% is up from, maybe 15 to 20% as of maybe 10 years ago. And so there's been a steep growth curve there, which is good. But what you're doing is you're entering large amounts of electricity generation into the system that are themselves variable. And so if you think about it, the higher percentage of a more volatile generation source that you have, the more opportunities there are for that heartbeat to trip out of line. And so what you need when you add more volatile or intermittent electricity generation is something that has very variable electricity demand.
So complementary, we can complement that supply, which is either use it or lose it, with demand that you could turn on and turn off to maximize utilization of that supply.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly. And so if you're thinking about, again, from like the grid operator's standpoint, they kind of have four levers that they can pull in order to maintain that balance. The first one is generation itself, right? So if it's a period of very high demand, then they can spin up a peaker plant. And by peaker, I just mean at peak demand. It used to be coal, largely now natural gas, can be fired up pretty quickly, meet that peak demand, and then ramp down. And same on the other side, if there's an overabundance of electricity, something can sometimes, not always, shut off. The second outlet would be transmission. And so by transmission, I don't necessarily mean transmission within that grid, but if an adjacent grid has some potential capacity, then sometimes you can offload that. There are limits, but that is an avenue that's available to help that balancing act.
To a neighboring grid, I assume distance is probably a factor, right?
Distance and physical connectivity have to be there, so it's not. It's definitely not a panacea, but it can be one tool.
Sure.
The third would be storage, which we touched on a little bit before in terms of batteries. Again, it's there, but it has somewhat limited functionality at grid scale. And then the last bucket is called demand response. And so this is where Bitcoin mining is sort of the new entrant on the scene with respect to what it can do from the demand side of the equation to help balance grids. So what demand response means is simply the grid operator has a program that, certain companies or entities can participate in to agree to essentially turn off if the grid needs them to turn off, or to accept electricity when there's an overabundance of it. Usually it's more in the former. And so inside of this demand response category, I mean, again, going before Bitcoin mining, kind of the state-of-the-art status quo would be a high energy industrial process, like maybe like a steel plant or something like that, where let's say there's an overabundance of electricity because there's not a lot of demand, but we have extremely high generation, whether it's because of renewables or something else. Then instead of wasting that energy, they can at least go and make a product out of it. The problem with that is that it's actually difficult to kind of quote unquote spin up a physical industrial process. It can't be done immediately. There's no, that's sort of, it's on or off. There's no dialing up or down, and you can't do it very quickly. So the difficulty in load balancing in a modern grid is often that you have this increasing volatility of electricity generation. You need a commensurate tool on the other side that supplies that same level of ability to be sort of modulated up and down. And that's where Bitcoin mining data centers really fit in very nicely, because they can, in a minute, turn off or modulate down if the grid needs that electricity to be given back into the system. And on the other side, when there's an overabundance of renewable generation, either because it's very sunny that day or because it was super windy in the early morning, instead of just simply wasting those watts that were generated from these clean renewable sources, we can actually put them to a productive use by mining Bitcoin. And in this sense, Bitcoin sort of serves as an energy battery, if you will, of indefinite storage life.
Interesting. So the whole complaint about Bitcoin being or taking up so much energy is really a complaint that's not really well applied in this case, because Bitcoin appears to use energy that the grid is not using, or that it doesn't have capacity for. Is that sort of how it is?
That's right. And again, I would qualify it by saying that there are many different kinds of examples, many different grid designs. And so what we're talking about here is sort of the free market of ERCOT. But I think what's lost in the discussion sometimes about Bitcoin and its energy usage is that Bitcoin mining is one of the most competitive businesses I've ever seen. It is exceptionally difficult to reliably and consistently, generate profits. And in order to, at this point, in sort of Bitcoin's evolution and how much the network has grown and where hash rate is today in terms of the amount of energy being modulated through the system, you have to be exceptionally efficient as a miner, and most importantly, your power procurement agreement has to be at a very low price. So, said simply, unless your cost of energy is extremely cheap or near zero as a Bitcoin miner, it's hard to make any money. And so what that means, if you think about it, is that Bitcoin miners cannot afford to pay sort of average prices within a grid, what you or I may see on our bill, or what a company might pay for the electricity at an industrial facility, because they simply wouldn't make any money. And so the idea that Bitcoin mining kind of quote unquote takes energy away from other uses is not always, it doesn't describe what's happening in the real world very well, because what Bitcoin mining really is designed to do, I mean, I don't mean that in the sense that it was designed like this from the beginning, but the way that it is integrated into the complex adaptive system that is our energy system, is that it will migrate to where energy costs the least. And that is by definition where it is otherwise essentially wasted and has no price.
No price because there's no demand. No one's turning on the lights necessarily at 3 o'clock in the morning, or much less people are, right?
Exactly.
That's interesting. So that means that we're not choosing between either we're Bitcoin mining or we're turning the lights on. It's really when there's no demand or very low demand and excess supply, where does that supply go to? It sounds like the miners can then soak up that supply to increase the utility of especially these renewables, right?
Exactly. And let's have one quick example, because I think it's always easier. You know, in West Texas, you know, they have not just tremendous, you know, traditional energy resources in terms of oil and gas, but it's, you know, it's very sunny there and it's very windy, particularly at night. Actually, in West Texas, it's when where a lot of their energy resource really comes through wind. And so if you're a project finance person looking to, you know, scope out, like, let's say a 1 megawatt, you know, wind energy installation in West Texas, before Bitcoin mining, your project cash flows looked something like, well, maybe 40% of the time we're going to be able to sell this energy internally to the local community. Maybe there's 5,000 homes and 50 businesses, but these are rural areas. A lot of the best areas for renewables are not right next to cities. They're out kind of in the middle of nowhere, not exclusively, but many of them. And so there are not high transmission voltage lines, which are very expensive, connecting this rural area to Dallas or Houston. There may be some, but it's not enough for the amount of renewables that have been put into this area. And so before Bitcoin mining, your project cash flows look something like 40% of the time we can sell this energy to the local community, and 60% of the time we may not have a buyer. What Bitcoin mining allows you to do is to say, for every kilowatt hour that you generate, you will always have a price. There will always be a buyer to soak up whatever energy nobody else wants. And as soon as the grid needs it, as soon as the local community needs it, we can just shut off. Because at that point, because of the local demand, it'll probably be at a price that we couldn't afford anyway.
Right.
And so in this sense, you know, what Bitcoin mining does for renewables, in a way, is provide a price signal that's market-based and not just subsidy-based, kind of from government tax credits, et cetera.
What do you mean by price signal?
What Bitcoin mining is saying in one of these sort of renewable build-outs is, don't ever worry about not having a place to sell your excess energy, because we can locate, you know, shipping containers on site that don't have to be plugged in to anything except the literal actual energy generation facility, which maybe in this case is a bunch of wind turbines, and we just need to connect, you know, to the internet via satellite internet or whatever it is, in order to interact with this new anchor customer, which is the Bitcoin network, which is 24/7, 365 available as your new buyer of last resort for energy that previously didn't have a price or a buyer.
Interesting. So we've been talking about renewable energy and how this new energy input requires some need to stabilize the grid. What are some other demands for Bitcoin mining? I remember you mentioned to me in a previous conversation flaring, or companies using or companies burning excess gas. Mm-hmm. Where does Bitcoin mining fit into that?
So this is an area that I'm very passionate about, because it's very important from a climate perspective. Methane emission is what we're really talking about here. And just to level set on this, you hear a lot about carbon and CO2 and mainly because of its greenhouse effect. So we're all familiar with this. The issue is that methane, which is a different molecule, essentially natural gas, although not precisely, methane is something like 80 times worse than CO2 per unit mass in terms of greenhouse effect. And so if we're looking for the highest impact, highest leverage ways to mitigate some of what we would think of as climate change causing activities, we would do better to focus on methane first in many ways. Not saying that CO2 doesn't matter.
Sure.
Methane, once it's emitted into the atmosphere, will degrade into mostly CO2 about 8 to 9 years after it enters the atmosphere. And it starts out being hundreds of times worse than CO2 in terms of greenhouse effect, kind of degrading down to being essentially CO2. So that's where I get the 80 times figure on average over those 8 to 9 years. And if you look at methane emissions globally by source, you know, they're kind of like three big parts to the pie chart. You know, one would be landfills. And so, you know, landfills, due to the natural decomposition of organic matter in them, will emit methane. Agriculture. And then the third big one is oil and gas. And so actually Bitcoin mining is addressing two of those three. Methane emission coming off of landfills. But the more developed case is more in sort of traditional oil and gas, where let's take shale as an example. You know, shale development here in the U.S. When you drill an oil well or an oil-directed shale well, you will always produce some level of natural gas or methane. And if
as a byproduct,
right? They kind of exist together in the ground.
Okay.
And so if there's a really good oil well that's a bit distant from existing pipeline infrastructure, which happens all the time, then a company may go and drill that oil-directed well and produce what's called associated gas with that. But the oil is more valuable per unit volume, and so you can either truck the oil or pipe the oil, but less often is there a different pipeline system that's already there for natural gas. I mean, there are obviously very extensive natural gas pipeline systems, but not always in exactly where you've just drilled for oil.
Sure.
So what this leads to is something called flaring, which you may have seen pictures of, you know, where you see like a dark expanse and then these flares that are kind of coming out of the ground.
Seemingly nowhere, right?
Out of seemingly nowhere.
Right.
And so what's happening there, the worst thing that you can do is just let that methane seep into the atmosphere for the reasons that we just talked about.
So it's better to light them on fire, essentially, because you convert into CO2 quicker.
That's correct.
Right? Which is better
That's
for
correct.
the ozone layer.
That's correct. But what's even better than that is if you, again, just take a modular shipping container with Bitcoin miners in it and hook up that gas well that's essentially a byproduct of your traditional energy development, run it through a generator, use that electricity to mine Bitcoin, you can emit a much cleaner stream of gas into the atmosphere, which is just CO2 without all the particulate and other impurities in it, and end up with Bitcoin. And so, you know, it's really, and there's enough, you know, flared gas in the world to run the Bitcoin network multiple times over.
Wow.
And so when you think about that, there is a real use case for Bitcoin mining to sit next to traditional energy in a process that we already rely on that allows us to get to a cleaner outcome, essentially, and have Bitcoin.
Fascinating. So let's get outside of the United States, a big world out there, and talk about Africa. I'd love to hear how Bitcoin mining could affect positive change in the grid system in different parts of Africa You mentioned excess renewable energy. I assume that's sort of where that's coming from as well. Could you provide an example there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to talk about this angle because it's not just, developed advanced grids with, these, sort of complex load balancing mechanisms where Bitcoin mining fits in. It actually fits in energy systems that look completely different, right? And so I use the example of Bondo, in the article, and this is leveraging off of work by Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation, as well as a company out of Kenya called Gridless, which is doing a lot of work in this area. But when you look at Africa, I mean, outside of some of the cities, I mean, there really don't exist grids as we think about them, right? And the estimates are that there's something like 600 million people in Africa that don't have access to electricity at all. So often what you have in these more rural, less economically advanced areas, if they have any kind of power generation at all, it might be some philanthropist or a foreign government at some point felt like they wanted to do something good. And so they essentially seeded investment into, let's say, taking a river and turning it into like a micro hydro scheme. So that was the example that I used, where Africa has a tremendous amount of natural potential energy. And I think this is also something that is important to say. We are surrounded by energy abundance, right? It's like we have more energy kind of coursing around us in different ways than we'll ever hope to harness. So I think it's important to move kind of from a scarcity mindset about energy to more of an abundance mindset about energy, even though we need to break the link with carbon, right? In order to kind of make sure we're doing everything responsibly and be climate aware. But in Africa, there are lots of areas where there's a little bit of electricity generation, but there aren't that many people around who are using all of it. And so let's take an example of Bondo, which is just a small village area with a few thousand people. A philanthropist came in, years ago and built what is essentially like a small hydroelectric facility on a river there. And right now, when people wake up in the morning or they use a little bit of electricity to do this or that, or when they come home in the evening, maybe they have their lights on for a bit. But the river flows 24/7. And so the amount of potential electricity that's generated by nature is way more than the variable usage of this isolated community. But pre-Bitcoin mining, there's really nothing that they could have done about that. There's no high voltage transmission line to a grid. There's no other way for, again, it's use it or lose it. There's no other way for that to have been put to productive use. But, starting somewhat recently, Gridless in combination with others have gone in and installed, a Bitcoin mining facility essentially right next to the river and the hydro plant. So now, during the night when everybody's sleeping, all of that potential energy from the river is getting contributed to securing the global decentralized Bitcoin network, and they're getting compensated commensurately for those watts in Bitcoin, which is particularly useful in a country where the currency is very unstable. And in fact, they just had a overnight 40% devaluation in late 2023, which is, as you can imagine, pretty devastating for people,
right, for the community.
And while I'm giving you a small example, I will say it's important to say that this is not something that's just happening kind of at a small scale in a village, right? You've seen just here in the last month or two, the government of Kenya sign an agreement with the U.S.-based miner to explore all renewable development in Kenya with respect to allowing Bitcoin mining to come in and monetize the excess. You saw a law change in Ethiopia a couple years ago where high-performance compute was extremely tightly regulated, and they changed those regulations in order to essentially use more Bitcoin mining installations to monetize their overbuilt renewables. In their case, they have one of the largest hydroelectric facilities in the world. I can't remember how many gigawatts it is, but it's double-digit gigawatt facility, and they don't always use all of it. And so why not take that already existent clean energy and put it to use? And so in a way, Bitcoin mining acts as this sort of shock absorber that takes in energy that no one else wants within a system before it's use it or lose it. And because it's so highly interruptible, Bitcoin mining can be turned on and off, can be modulated up and down. It can be moved. So if, going back to that example in West Texas about that wind farm, let's say 10 years from now, there's now 20,000 families there and 500 businesses and more high voltage transmission. You don't really need maybe the Bitcoin mine there anymore because all of that energy is being put to kind of a higher use, if you want to think about it that way. Wonderful. So those shipping containers full of miners can be moved somewhere else. And so it has this wonderful degree of flexibility, not just in terms of being able to be turned up and down in its energy consumption sort of by the hour, but also in terms of flexibility across time and space, which is really unique and serves as a very useful extra tool kind of in the toolbox for either a grid operator within a complex grid trying to do something to help balance out the increased load from renewables or the increased generation capacity from renewables, or something as simple as soaking up the excess potential energy generated by a river in the middle of nowhere in Africa.
This is fascinating. I could talk to you about this all day, but we won't nerd out too much more. But it is fascinating that Bitcoin mining can be used for all these different things. And what I found, one of the things I found interesting about this discussion is precisely what we did not mention, which is, all of these sort of very high-flying people trying to say, well, Bitcoin's going to the moon, or, is a get-rich-quick scheme, which isn't really what this conversation was about, quite the contrary. So it's fascinating to see real use cases that weren't made up for Bitcoin, but rather that Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining addresses in a very real way to stabilize the grid, but also to use renewable energy. And as you said, we are constantly surrounded by a significant amount more energy than we know what to do with or we're able to use. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin mining is just one way that we can increase utility of those energy sources.
That's right. And I think it's fascinating also because Bitcoin often gets criticized for being volatile, right? And what's volatile about Bitcoin, especially for financial types who are sitting behind a computer all day, the dollar price of it is volatile. That's just a fact that we can state. But Bitcoin as a system, internal to the Bitcoin network, Bitcoin only understands Bitcoin, doesn't understand dollars. It's exceptionally stable, exceptionally anti-fragile and self-correcting. And I think with the energy discussion, part of the irony is that, while Bitcoin from a price standpoint gets criticized for being volatile, it's doing exactly the opposite inside of the energy systems that it interacts with. It actually helps remove some of the volatility that exists in those systems by acting as that shock absorber and allowing those systems to operate at a higher degree of potential output, higher degree of reliability, and at the end of the day, be a net benefit to not just the grid itself, but the people who depend on that energy to better their lives.
Wonderful. Well, Alex, thank you very much for this discussion. thoroughly enjoyed it,
Thank you.
and I hope you
Appreciate
have
it.
as well.
All right.